Products to cost you more. That's because of a new 21% tax on tomato imports from Mexico starting today. This was put into place by the Trump administration. According to the Associated Press, Mexico supplies roughly 70% of the tomatoes we eat here. News Channel 3's Princess Johnny Steverson joining us live from Los Brothers Mexican restaurant in Kalamazoo. And the owner spoke with you about the potential impact this tariff will have on their business. Princess?
She did, Jess, and she tells me that tomatoes and just about every other type of produce that you can imagine that's imported from outside the United States is costing more every single year. The price of ketchup, salsa, and any other tomato-based food that you can think of is expected to soon go up in price. It comes as the Trump administration cut a nearly 30-year trade deal with Mexican-grown produce. Not only is a roughly 21% tax on tomatoes expected to take effect today, but that number could reach 30% after yet another tariff threatened by the Trump administration if a new deal isn't reached between the U.S. and Mexico by August 1st. The moves have left grocery stores and restaurants like Los Brothers in a difficult spot.
Pero de veces tenemos que usar sustitutos para sustituir el jitomate, o sea, el jitomate o las cosas que vienen exportadas de México.
Adriana Hernandez is the co-owner. She says prices go up every year regardless of tariffs. However, instead of eating the cost or bringing up prices, they'll begin to analyze internally for substitutes if prices increase for tomatoes, which is a key ingredient in their salsa and fillings for their burritos.
El jitomate porque es un precio muy elevado. Entonces lo que nosotros tenemos que hacer, usamos otros productos como el tomate en lata, que es más barato.
According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a pound of field-grown tomatoes is currently $1.70. I spoke to Brad Hirschbein. He's the senior economist and deputy director of research at the W.E. Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. He says there are pros and cons to be considered.
We're the fourth largest producer in the world. We're actually bigger than Mexico, and there's the possibility that we can still produce a lot of tomatoes domestically.
And on the other hand,
as the prices rise, we're likely to see the consumer anywhere from 10 to 15 cents more per pound of fresh tomatoes that you buy.
Hirschbein says in 1996, Mexico and the United States got together to create a price range for tomatoes that was meant to protect U.S. growers.
The global food system is far more political than most people realize. Behind the produce aisles of supermarkets and the simple act of buying tomatoes lies a complex web of trade agreements, regulatory decisions, national interests, and economic consequences that ripple across borders. Few industries illustrate this reality more clearly than what recently happened to the U.S. tomato industry. A decision involving Canada, the United States, and Mexico triggered a chain reaction that upended long-standing trade patterns. American tomato producers found themselves facing collapsing exports, falling prices, and mounting uncertainty. At the same time, Mexico emerged as the unexpected beneficiary, capturing billions of dollars in market share almost overnight. The result was a dramatic shift in North American agriculture. And it all began with a ban. For decades, the United States and Canada maintained a deeply interconnected agricultural trade relationship. Fresh produce flowed north and south with relative ease, supported by trade agreements designed to stabilize prices and ensure supply. Tomatoes were a key part of that system. American growers, particularly in states like Florida and California, relied heavily on access to the Canadian market. Canada, in turn, depended on imported tomatoes to supplement domestic production, especially during off-seasons. This balance held for years, creating predictability for farmers, distributors, and retailers on both sides of the border. That stability did not last. Canada's decision to restrict certain U.S. tomato imports sent shockwaves through the industry. The move was rooted in regulatory and trade disputes that had been building quietly for years. Issues involving pricing practices, seasonal dumping allegations, and compliance with trade rules reached a breaking point. When the restrictions took effect, the impact on U.S. growers was immediate. Shipments destined for Canadian markets were halted or delayed. Contracts were canceled. Excess supply flooded the domestic U.S. market, driving prices down. Farmers who had planned their planting seasons around export demand suddenly found themselves with surplus crops and shrinking margins. For many producers, tomatoes are not a flexible crop. Investments are made months in advance, labor is hired, inputs are purchased. Once the harvest arrives, there are limited options. When a major export market disappears, losses mount quickly. As American growers struggled, another player was ready: Mexico. Mexican tomato producers had spent years expanding capacity, modernizing greenhouses, and improving logistics. They benefited from lower labor costs, favorable climates, and significant investment in protected agriculture. When Canada restricted U.S. tomatoes, Mexican exporters moved fast. Supply chains shifted. Canadian importers, facing gaps in supply, turned south. Mexican tomatoes filled shelves that once held American produce. Prices stabilized for Canadian consumers, but the source of those tomatoes changed. The scale of the shift was staggering. Within a short period, Mexico captured an estimated $12 billion in additional market value tied to tomato exports and related agricultural trade. What had once been a competitive three-way market became increasingly dominated by Mexican producers. For the United States, this was more than a temporary setback. The tomato industry supports tens of thousands of jobs, from farm labor and transportation to packaging and distribution. As revenues fell, growers cut back. Some operations reduced acreage. Others exited the industry altogether. Rural communities felt the strain. The political response was swift and emotional. U.S. producers accused Canada of unfair trade practices. Lawmakers demanded action. Industry groups warned that American agriculture was being undermined by regulatory decisions beyond their control. But the deeper issue ran beyond any single policy. This crisis exposed how vulnerable the U.S. agricultural sector had become to sudden trade disruptions. While American farmers operate at massive scale, they often rely on a small number of export markets. When access is restricted, alternatives are limited. Mexico's success highlighted a contrasting strategy. Rather than relying on legacy markets alone, Mexican producers diversified export destinations. They invested in efficiency and year-round production. They positioned themselves as a reliable supplier regardless of political turbulence. Canada's role was pragmatic. Faced with trade disputes and regulatory concerns, Canadian authorities prioritized domestic rules and consumer supply. When U.S. tomatoes became contentious, Canada did not reduce consumption. It simply changed suppliers. That decision reshaped North American agriculture. The consequences extended beyond tomatoes. Other U.S. produce sectors began to worry. If tomatoes could be displaced so quickly, what about berries, peppers, or leafy greens? Confidence in long-term export access weakened. Meanwhile, Mexico's agricultural sector gained momentum. Increased revenues fueled reinvestment. Infrastructure improved, supply chains strengthened. The $12 billion payday was not just profit, it was leverage. For consumers, the transition was almost invisible. Tomatoes remained available, prices stabilized. But behind the scenes, an entire industry was being reordered. The situation also reignited debates over trade policy. Supporters of stricter enforcement argued that protecting domestic industries required firm action. Critics countered that trade disputes often backfire, creating opportunities for competitors rather than safeguarding local producers. In this case, the outcome was clear. The U.S. tomato industry lost ground. Canada secured supply. Mexico won big. The lesson was harsh but unmistakable. In a globalized food system, supply chains move quickly. Markets do not wait for political resolution. When one supplier stumbles, another steps in. For American growers, recovery will not be easy. Rebuilding lost markets takes years. Competing with lower-cost producers requires structural change, not short-term relief. For Mexico, the challenge will be sustaining growth without triggering new disputes. Success invites scrutiny. For Canada, the episode reinforced the importance of diversification. And for the global agricultural economy, the tomato trade became a case study in how policy decisions can reshape industries overnight. In the end, this was not just about tomatoes. It was about power, preparedness, and the unforgiving nature of global markets. When trade doors close, someone else walks through them. Thanks for watching Alert 360 News, where real stories meet real impact. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, smash that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the fastest growing news community on YouTube.